This morning we are moving right along in our class period, and the quarter is going by rapidly. I guess we're about halfway through, but we're talking about Jesus, and we're talking about the simple reality that Jesus can, and if we allow Him, He will change our lives for the better. And that's exactly what God's plan is. We've noticed those passages already that call on us to imitate Jesus. And that's not just for the purpose of, trying to be better than other people. We don't follow the Lord so that we can just look down our nose at our neighbor or coworker or family member and say, I'm better than you because I'm more closely aligned in my life with the Lord. That's not for that purpose at all. It's not really for necessarily just even behavioral modification. I think sometimes we get the impression that's all that God is interested in, just modifying our behavior. And while if we do follow Jesus, we will live differently than the world around us, Romans 12 certainly teaches us that. We'll not be conformed to the world. There's a deeper purpose in mind, and we're going to talk about that a little bit at the worship hour as it relates to how we really know God. And that's His desire, that we really know Him. But what does that even involve itself? Well, we'll save that for the next hour. But Jesus really gives us a preview, I think, of what God wants us to be and what He promises to make us, those who try to walk in His footsteps when eternity commences and this life on earth is no more and God in some way makes everything right again. That's the promise that the book of Revelation closes with. And, we kind of get caught up sometimes, I think, and it's easy to do so because we read about a street of gold, gates of pearl, a sea of crystal, and those things amaze our imagination to try to think about what that will really be like, and our sight and our mind tries to picture it. And while those things are marvelous indeed, and I look forward to experiencing those, I think the deeper reality will be that we will be in God's presence. And John says it, we will be with God and we shall see Him as He is. We will be with God and He will be our God and we will be His people. And in some way, maybe Jesus just gives us a preview of what that will be like as He goes through life, conducting Himself as He did, and ask us again to try to do the same as we live in this life. There we go. Has that been different? I don't know, maybe it's just my hearing. So, here's the question for this morning. If you noticed when we went through the schedule, a God-directed heart. Well, what does that really mean? I guess I'll frame it to you this way as we start. Do you work for God or with God? Now, you might think that question should be just reserved for people like me in my position, people that are employed, as it were. The Internal Revenue Service says that I'm employed by the church, and that's very important. If you try to be a self-contractor in religious matters, they really hammer you. That's a separate discussion for another time and place, and I know the tax code's unfair to all of us in a lot of different ways, but anyways, so you might say, well, yeah, you're the employee of the church, so you need to answer this question. Do you work for God or do you work with God? But it applies to all of us as Christians. Do we work for or with? You may say, well, is there really that much of a difference? Aren't you just basically saying the same thing? I think there is a slight difference. And I think if you really latch onto this, it will help you in your outlook, in your perspective. Here's the way Paul said it in 2 Corinthians 6, verse 1. And you might remember from when we studied this epistle, those that were present on that Wednesday night quarter, I guess that was last year, it may have even been the year before now as quickly as time passes, but we said that Paul was defending himself in the second letter to Corinth, that there were those who were making accusations that he was just a con man, a fraudster, that he was just in it for the money. And it's curious to me that those accusations were made 2,000 years ago and they're still made today. But the sad reality is that they were made long ago because there were people who did that. And there are people today, and some of you, you could easily supply me with names, and I could supply you with names, who through the last few years in the name of religion or Christianity especially have used that to their financial benefit. And I just shake my head in amazement and in disgust. It would be comedic, it would be funny, except for the fact that these guys, and even some ladies now have joined in, have so exploited, God, if you will, or exploited religion or exploited Christianity, to use it in the broadest sense of the term, for financial gain. And you can watch these guys and gals on late night TV, and you know what I'm talking about. And all the, you call the 1-800 number and make your donation, and God's going to bless you. And the guy that always was, I guess, too much for me was the guy that I watched, and he would invite people to actually come to the TV, and you could put your hand on the TV screen. In some way he would go back and forth. He would transfer you some supposed power from God. Well, you might get some static electricity and get a zap or whatever. If you have a loose connection, loose wire in your cord, it might give you a zap, but that's all it's going to do. You're not going to get anything out of that. So Paul is writing to people that again are accusing him, you're just a con man, if you will. You're a snake oil salesman. And we've got a number of different idioms in our English language that try to describe people that deceive others, but Paul said that's not who I am. And so the book of 2 Corinthians, he details his defense of his work as an apostle. And including them, he said, we then, meaning those that he's writing to, the Christians at Corinth. And you can remember how he described them in the first book, in those chapters, as being people that needed a lot of help in walking faithfully with the Lord. But nevertheless, he said, we then as workers together with him, that is, with God, also plead with you not to receive the grace of God in vain. Do you work with God or do you work for God? There's a difference. If I'm just working for, and that may be the way that you view your secular employment, you might name the company that you work for, and the task that the boss or the manager, the foreman, whoever gives you, is for the betterment of that company or corporation. It's for the betterment of their bottom line. You're there to produce a product or to offer a service or to further whatever the company is in charge of doing. You're there to promote and to, push that process along in some way so that those who are shareholders or stockholders or whomever it is, the owner, that their bottom line, their revenue, their profit loss statement at the end of the year shows they made more money than they lost, and preferably that they made even more money this year than they did the year previous, and that sort of growth. And you may just feel like a small cog in the wheel, depending on where you work and who you work for and how appreciative they are. And maybe sometimes we're too quick to adopt that mindset when it comes with God. Well, I'm just a Christian and I go to church and I work for God in that way, and I offer my worship and I try to be kind and nice and a good neighbor, and I contribute financially to the work of the church, and I'm just working for, and yes, I'm expecting a payoff kind of at the end of the day, if you will, or the end of the week. I'm expecting a payoff at the end of my life to go to heaven, but certainly the Bible tells me I can't earn that, I can't deserve that. I might receive a check, at the end of the week that shows 40 hours worked for a certain hourly rate. And again, Uncle Sam gets his cut out of it. But whatever that payment is that goes into the bank, you can say, well, I earned that through my hard work and effort. And hopefully you were deserving of, in fact, the money that you received. Well, working with God doesn't work that way, because no matter what we do for Him, it's nothing that He could not do Himself. No matter what we do for God, it's nothing that could ever make Him indebted to us, as if we had performed some task or did some work that He Himself could not accomplish by other means if He wished. But still, what God invites us to do is to work with Him, to share with Him in His work. Or the big word today that a lot of times is thrown around is the word mission. And I like that word, mission. You've served in the military. I know we have some who have. You understand that idea maybe better than those of us who have always been in the civilian world. But in military terms, a mission, you have an objective. You have a chain of command, those that are briefing you and telling you, here's what we're going to do. Here's what we hope to accomplish. And, sometimes it's pretty mundane, but sometimes it can be very dangerous. And in fact, as most of you know, it may cost some of you your life, but this is what we're trying to do. And Jesus, I think, comes and says, here's my mission, and I want you to be a part of it. It won't always be easy. In fact, many times it'll be difficult if you read what Jesus said, and it'll cost you. You have to deny yourself, and it cost certainly Jesus more than it cost any of us or will. Even if we were to lose our lives in service to the Lord, it cost Him His life, being the only one who never deserved death Himself. But that was so that His mission could be accomplished and our salvation could be granted. Well, what are we talking about? Let me give you a practical example here, or at least maybe a little bit more practical. You probably don't recognize this guy. I wouldn't expect you to. But this guy, his name's Frank Laubach. Frank Laubach. Now, if you have studied education theory, you might have run across Laubach because he's famous in that realm for another reason. But he was born in 1884, and he was what we would call today a Congregationalist minister of a Congregationalist church or denomination. And he made it his goal to be what he called or considered himself a missionary to the illiterate. And this was at a time in our country's history where, again, not every child had an opportunity to get an education. Some of you might have even remembered that, if you were living in a rural setting, you might have went to school part of the year, but then when it was time to, get the crops in, you might have had to kind of skip out on the rest of school. That's kind of foreign to the way that we think today, but I've heard my parents and grandparents talk about that reality, and many times, after a boy or girl's 6th or 7th, 8th grade, might be that work around the farm necessitated no high school. And so they would do that. Others might go a little bit, but going further in education wasn't really something that was done. But in 1884, as he began to teach children, to read, and he used the Bible as one of his textbooks, and he taught a lot of people about the love of God in that way. Upon reaching his 45th birthday, that's kind of important to me. My last one was a few weeks ago the same. He said that I resolved to live, this is his quote, in continuous inner conversation with God and in perfect responsiveness to His will. Now, he's not saying I want to live perfectly necessarily, but he says what I want to do is I want to try to live every moment with an awareness of what God would have me to do and to be in every moment. I don't want to let anything distract me from that. Now, that was something that, as I read about it, it was quite amazing. And so he begins to enter things into his personal diary, and his personal diary survives. And so here's one of the questions. I forget, let me see if I can find out which... These are, this is in his diary. He didn't date what this was. I think this is prior to his actual experiment. So he's going to experiment. Can I always live with an awareness of God? And this is going to, of course, tie back in with Jesus, who always lived with an awareness of what God wanted him to be. And so we're trying to imitate that. But he said, can we have that contact with God all the time? That is, that awareness. Now, he's not talking about, I don't think, anything mysterious. He's not talking about, God tapping us on the shoulder or whispering in our ear or nothing like that. He's just talking about, can I focus my mind on living for the Lord every moment of every day? He said, so can we have that contact with God all the time awake, fall asleep in His arms and awaken in His presence? Can we attain that? Can we do His will all the time? That's the question. I choose to make the rest of my life an experiment in answering that question. And that's interesting. I want to try. And so you can still, if you want to order it online, you can still find his records of diary entries where he tried to do this. And I'm not going to read, of course, the entirety of it to you. He lived in 1970. So he had... he had 40 years to try this experiment. He died at 85, and he started this experiment at 45. And just some of these entries, for instance. Here's one. He said, the concentration upon God is strenuous, but everything else has ceased to be so. I think more clearly. I forget less frequently. Things which I did with a strain before, I now do easily and with no effort whatever. I worry about nothing and I lose no sleep. I walk on air a good part of the time. That's figurative language, of course, but he said, I've got it made. Things are better for me now. Even the mirror reveals a new light in my eyes and face. I no longer feel in a hurry about anything. Everything goes right. Every minute I meet calmly as though it were not important. Nothing can go wrong except one thing. That is that God may slip from my mind. Now, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could all say that's the way we live every day? I can tell you that I've not lived every day in my past 45 years that way. I hope to live more of them if I have 40 more or 4 more. I don't know how many of those are remaining, but to live in that way, where you walk with the air in your step, as it were, where you don't worry about anything, where nothing seems to be hurried or rushed. You just take life as it comes because you're trusting God. You're focused on His goodness and His will and the way that He wants to work things out. And as he closes that particular entry, he said, nothing can go wrong except one thing, that I might let God slip from my mind. So how often do we focus our mind on God? The Bible tells us to do that. Philippians 2 verse 5, to have the mind of Christ. And we're going to see momentarily how Jesus always had His mind on doing what God wanted Him to do. The familiar passage in Colossians 3 where the Bible said, set your mind on things above. And so how we think and how we go through life, our focus and our perspective determines how successful we'll be in serving the Lord. Jesus was always, if you want to use this term, connected. Again, that's a buzzword today. We have to be connected. And you've got one I was going to say you've got one in your pocket. Mine's not in my pocket. It's usually right there, but it's right here. We're always connected. And we are connected via our phones. Do you remember the time when you could actually leave the house, and if you were leaving, your parents behind or your spouse behind, you could actually tell them, I'll be back, later on, and they had no way or no capacity. They had nothing to do other than to trust that, in fact, if you were leaving that morning, that they could expect you back if you told them, after work or after the ball game or whatever, and that was the only thing they could do. And today, parenting is much different, isn't it? Today, when we leave the house, we want to make sure you've got your little device with you. And yes, I'm one of those parents, and maybe some of you are too. Some of you might even not be aware, but your children may be tracking you to know where you're at every moment. And I would tell you that I've done that with my mother's phone. I've not, but my sister did. Okay, so you didn't hear that, but she did. So, where's Mom at? Well, we can just find her. So we're connected. We're always connected. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, that's a social debate for another time and place. But look in John's Gospel and listen to how Jesus went through life. And again, this is where I hope it will turn somewhat practical for us. Are we always connected to God? Well, we should be. Jesus was. John 5:19, he said, most assuredly I say to you, the Son can do nothing of himself, but what he sees the Father do. For whatever he does, that is, whatever God does, the Son also does in like manner. Jesus, trying to prove his identity and to assert his authority to do the things that he was doing, met with resistance from the religious leaders. And they're basically saying, hey, who do you think you are? You've had some encounters like that with people. Hey, who do you think you are? Maybe it's the new person at work. They're strutting around like they know everything, and you've worked there for 40 years, and you know the ins and outs much better than they do. Well, it may come to find out, they're the grandson of the owner, or they have some prominence that you don't, whether earned or not. But, Jesus comes on the scene, and he begins to do things, and he begins to make claims, and we can understand a little bit of the skepticism of the people that might have encountered him initially, the religious leaders and otherwise. Who are you claiming to be? Now, of note, Jesus never shied away from that question. He didn't dismiss it, but he began to prove to them. He began to demonstrate, this is who I am. And this is who I am because of the things that were written before about me, the prophecies in the Old Testament and so forth. These I am fulfilling. And the claims that I am making are not empty or bombastic. I'm not just bragging saying, hey, I'm the Son of God. There's actually a psychological malady that's listed for counselors and psychologists called the Messiah complex. If you're familiar with psychology, there are people that actually think, they're a god. And some trace it back, to ancient times and say, this guy claims to be a god. Well, he claimed that, but guess what? He backed it up. He proved that he was. And so he said, what you see the Father doing, that's what I'm doing. The same chapter, John chapter 5 and verse 30, look at this and just think about the amazing weight of these words. He said, Jesus, I can of myself do nothing. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is righteous, because I do not seek my own will, but the will of the Father who sent me. I'm not just an ordinary Joe out here, claiming to be something that I'm not. I can do nothing of myself. Of myself, I can do nothing. Now, that should give us pause even with that first sentence to evaluate how we often go through life and the claims that we make and maybe the attempts that we take of whatever sort, whatever pursuit we're engaging in, and we sometimes rely on our own strength. We even talk about the old expression, we pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps, right? That's kind of the American spirit. We pulled ourselves up by our own bootstraps. I made my own way. I blazed my own trail. I did it my way. Was that Frank Sinatra? I think that was Frank Sinatra. That said that. It's all about me. It's my ingenuity. It's my initiative. It's my intellect. That's what's, going to make it possible for me to make it through life. Well, Jesus said, I can of myself do nothing. Is he talking about eating and feeding himself? Just accomplishing the regular everyday activities of life? Well, I don't think he's being that absurd, but he's talking about the things that he was doing, of course, in the mission of God again. And for all of us as his followers today, we can say no different. Of ourselves, we can do nothing. But what he did is what we do, and the example he left is the one we follow. The strength and power he gives is the one that empowers us. As I hear, I judge. My judgment is righteous. The things I'm doing, I'm seeking not my own will, but the will of the Father who sent me. Now, of all of the temptations that Jesus faced, we read about at least three of those encounters, or three of those particular temptations, with the encounter that he has with the devil in Matthew chapter 4 and Luke chapter 4. You remember, command these stones to be bread. After 40 days, that would have been a great temptation with no food. I ate breakfast. If I had the power, to make me something right now, I'd be tempted to do it. And that was, less than an hour ago, less than 4 hours ago, and I'm hungry again. But Jesus said, no, we live by the Word of God. That's what man lives by. That's what gives us our true strength and sustenance. Jesus said, not just physically, but spiritually. That's the important part. So, devil, not going to take that bait. Well, the devil said, the Bible says, using the Lord's own tactics against him, or attempting to, here's the top of the temple. And if you jump off, the Bible says in Psalm 91 that the angels will catch you and bear you up, lest you dash your foot against a stone. Psalm 91 had said that, but it wasn't to be used in that way. It's an improper interpretation of it. Well, it's written again, devil, you shall not tempt the Lord your God. So Jesus dismisses with that temptation. Well, just look around you, Jesus, as they're on a high mountain, whatever mountain that was. Here are the kingdoms of the world. And some people suggest that this was something that we can kind of appreciate because we have movies and TV shows that can help us with our imagination that they didn't in that day. But, kind of down through the halls of time, here's all the great empires and emperors and kings and monarchs and whoever they are. Here's all of the wealth and all of the things that the world offers, the power and the prestige. Jesus, it's yours if you fall down and worship me. Nope, not going to do it, devil. Because the Bible says, God, my Father has said, worship Him only. Only He is to be served. And so He dispenses with the devil. Those temptations were, again, very specific, and we read about them. The Hebrew writer tells us later in Hebrews chapter 4 that He was tempted in all points like as we are, yet without sin. Now here's the question based on what we've read here from John 5:30. What was the greatest temptation? That is, which one had the most appeal? You know, we all have a temptation that is more appealing to us than most any other. You fishermen guys, you know, you understand this. You know, my whole fishing career was just, you know, digging up some worms in the backyard and going down to the creek. I got with some of my buddies and they said, let's go fishing. I said, okay. And he pulls out a filing cabinet. And he's got a filing, it's not really a filing cabinet, but you know, one of these big tackle boxes, and he's got about 4 gazillion, you know. I said, where's your worms at? And he said, you don't fish with worms. You got to use this bait or that bait. You know, you've got to make something that makes the fish happy. And I'm like, you know, what do? Just say into the water, you know, what do you want to eat today, little buddy, you know, and throw it in there. I couldn't figure that out, you know, but there's something that is more appealing on certain days or conditions to fish than others, and I'm not skilled enough to know that. Again, you'll have to ask our fisherman buddies to explain that to you, but there's a temptation that's more tempting to you than to others. Some are tempted to kleptomania. Do you know a kleptomaniac? These are individuals that for some reason they are just you know, enthralled by the idea of stealing, and a lot of times it's just petty theft, it's shoplifting. You know, they just get a thrill out of going into Walmart and, you know, sticking something in their pocket or whatever. And you've read some of these crazy things. I read, it's been a few years ago, but you know, somehow a guy put a lobster in his pants and walked out. I just let him go. I mean, you know, I'm not going to eat that lobster, and I don't know anybody else that would either, but you know, but that was a thrill to him. Now that's not a temptation to me, lobster or anything else, to steal from Walmart, but I have my temptations and you have yours that are more alluring. Which one was most alluring to Jesus? The Bible doesn't tell me, so I'm speculating here, but when he says, I came not to do my own will, but the will of the Father who sent me, the power that he did possess, we read about it, making the blind see, restoring their sight, allowing the deaf to hear again, walking on the water, the surface of the water of the Sea of Galilee in the midst of a storm. You know, the power that he possessed, we would say was, you know, godly power, and it was because he was God in the flesh. But was he ever tempted? Do you think the greatest temptation was to use that in some way for his own personal benefit or advancement or welfare? I don't know. That would have been tempting, I think, in my life, but whatever it was for the Lord, he said, I've come to do the Father's will. John chapter 14, after telling the disciples that he's going to be betrayed, crucified, and killed on the cross, they're troubled, and you remember he gives them those words of encouragement about what's waiting for them and that he'll come back and take us to that place where there are many rooms or many mansions, as our older versions remind us. But to kind of bring that little section, tie a bow on it, he says, believe me, after they said, Philip, in a kind of a moment of a bit of hard-heartedness or a bit of just kind of obstinacy, well, just show us the Father, Jesus. That's sufficient for us. Verse 8, just let us see God and we can believe you. And Jesus probably shakes his head and said, you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And by way of summary, then he says in verse 11, believe me that I am in the Father and the Father in me, or else believe me because of the works, the sakes of the works themselves. In other words, these claims that I've made are not empty. And these guys even had really trouble wrapping their minds around it. Is he really the Son of God? Well, yes, because of what I've done. Jesus was to them, and if you back up in this passage, he's really translating to them God. He's really showing them, have I been so long with you, Philip? You have not known me. He who has seen me has seen the Father. So how can you say, show us the Father? Do you not believe that I am in the Father and the Father in me? The words that I speak to you, I do not speak on my own authority, but the Father who dwells in me does the works. Jesus showed us what God was like, this idea of translating. Now, I've not had the privilege of doing this, but I know if Brother Don were here, he could talk about the challenge that it is, like when they go to India. And of course, Telugu and Hindi and other languages they are not fluent in, so they're dependent upon the Indian brethren. One of our Indian brothers stands next to Brother Don, Jim, the others that go, and they will, say a phrase, and then they'll repeat it in the language that the hearers can understand. Adrian actually got to do this in Costa Rica He preached with a Spanish translator. And everybody that knows me said, you'd wear a translator out. You talk too fast, you move too much, they'd probably quit about halfway through your sermon. It'd be too hard. Maybe that's right. But, what they have to do, what that translator has to do is try to capture, of course, what the individual that's preaching is trying to convey. What Jesus did perfectly was not just try, but He accomplished. He captured what God wanted to communicate to us, both by His actions and His words, and all that He did to show us the Father, translating God to us. Now, what He wants from us is this. Here's kind of the simple takeaway for this lesson. What's this lesson about? How does Jesus change our lives? He wants us connected to God. And through Him we can be. And that's what we should aim for and try to change to more and more every day. John chapter 10. I know we've spent a lot of time in John's gospel, but I think it makes the point maybe with greater force than the other three, although they're beneficial to study in conjunction. But in John 10, Jesus talks about being the good shepherd. He talks about being the door of the sheep. He talks about how the imitator, the one that only pretends to be a shepherd, that is the hireling, he'll run away when trouble comes, but not him, not Jesus. I'm the good shepherd, and I know my sheep know me, and because we know each other, we can know the Father through Him, and I'll take care of Him. And that's a beautiful thing to try and wrap our minds around for sure. John 15, another image that Jesus describes that would have been familiar to them, that again is maybe a bit more obscure for us, even as shepherd and sheep, but also the vine and the branches. I am the vine. The grapevine, probably the type of vine He had in mind. I'm the one where the root system is found, the one that produces the growth. You're the branches that come out from me that find your nourishment and sustenance in me. And so your job, Jesus says, is to abide in me, and I'll abide in you. And then He makes this amazing statement. He says that unless, so that's a word that should get our attention, the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine. Neither can you unless you abide in me. You have to be connected to me. And that's the only way to have success in the Christian life. And if we choose not to be, without me you can do nothing, verse 5 ends. But then in verse 6 he adds, if anyone does not abide in me, is cast out as a branch and is withered. They gather them and throw them into the fire, and they're burned. We can understand that which is discarded, that which is disconnected from the life source, it's good for nothing. It shrivels up, it dies, it produces no fruit, it's of no benefit, and the only thing good that it is used for is for the fire. And that doesn't sound like something I want to be used for, and I know neither do you. Ephesians chapter 5, this connection, and we're going to build on this, as I said, at the worship hour a little bit, but he's talking about the husband-wife relationship. And he says that we are to have, and it should be 532, that says 533, but right 532, he said, it's a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. I'm speaking about a relationship that we enjoy with each other, Paul is saying, or that we enjoy with Jesus, that is comparable, that we can understand in our family units, but here it applies spiritually. And then Revelation 21, I mentioned this a little bit earlier. What God ultimately wants to do and desires for our eternity is that we will be with Him. And then we can fully understand and appreciate that. That's the passage coming down out of heaven, the holy city, New Jerusalem, described as a bride prepared and adorned for her husband. Again, that sort of language helps us understand the closeness, the intimacy, even if you want to use that word, that helps us understand what God desires for our connection with Him. He is to be our shepherd, we His sheep. He is the vine, we are the branches that bear fruit from the life that He gives us. And He is, even though I know you guys said, well, I don't have a husband. No, guys don't have a husband, but He is our husband. As members in the church, we are the bride. He is the husband, and all of the things that the Bible tells us perfectly for what a husband should do and be that all of us fail at, He won't. He'll care, He'll provide, He'll protect, He'll love. He'll do all of those things that again, sometimes we as husbands in this world fail to do for our wives as we should, but He won't for His bride, the church. And so we are to be connected with Him for that reason. So, how do we do that? Let me give you just something that I ran across, and it's been helpful to me, so you can decide if it's helpful to you or not. How do we direct our hearts to God? How can we stay connected to God? How do we do that day by day? This is just 4 words. They all begin with the letter W. They're very simple. Here's what you can give God. Give God your waking thoughts. First thing that you do in the morning, what is it? Do you say, oh no, it's another day? Be thankful you woke up. Many people didn't have that privilege. But if you wake up, let me urge you just to pause for a moment and give God your waking thoughts. In other words, if you want to get out of bed and do it by your bedside, or if you want to do it while you're still looking up at the ceiling, whatever, when the alarm clock goes off, give God your waking thoughts. And you don't have to spend an hour in prayer, but why don't you just spend 30 seconds or a minute or two and just say, God, today is a new day. Sometimes I review my day as if God doesn't know what I've got on docket. It's not like God doesn't have a copy of my itinerary. Yeah, I know what you've got planned, but what I try to do is to say, okay, here's what I've kind of got tentatively planned. There are some days I wake up with a little bit of dread, don't you? I'm not looking forward to that. I've got to talk to this person, and it's not going to be a comfortable conversation for whatever reason. Here's this project that, the deadline's today and I'm not sure how I'm going to finish it. Or, it's this issue that's going to be challenging. So give God your waking thoughts. He knows what you're facing, so give Him that. And that'll help you just kind of pause for a moment and do that. That's a lot better. I know some people, the first thing they do is just reach for their phone. They want to check, who's emailed me or who's posted on social media or what, terrible thing happened somewhere in the world. I've got to check the news. There'll be a time for that later in life, or later in the day, I should say. So give God your waking thoughts when you first awaken, and that will bless you, I believe. Number 2, give God your waiting thoughts. What I mean by that is, even though our lives are hectic and busy, depending on what stage of life you're at, you still have some waiting moments. You still have some time when, what could you be doing? And we can use maybe the waiting room example. If you're waiting for a medical appointment, yeah, you could read the, Sports Illustrated or Better Homes and Garden or whatever they're providing you for a magazine while you wait, or you could again play on your phone. But why not give God your waiting moments? And you can pray silently. You don't have to make a big deal out of it. You don't have to announce, with a booming voice to everyone in the waiting room, hey, everybody, I'm going to pray, so y'all quieten it down. You don't have to do anything like that, but give God your waiting moments. You can do that at a red light. Instead of, being frustrated with a silly driver in front of you, just offer a silent prayer to God and thank Him for the opportunity. Number 3, give God your whispering thoughts. Now, you may say, what are you talking about, your whispering thoughts? For me, and maybe it's just because of how kind of scattered my mind is sometimes, I'm trying to do 3 things simultaneously. Sometimes that doesn't end up that any of them turn out well. But maybe when you have one of those encounters and it's not going the way you want to, you can in the back of your mind even then, God, help me to say the right thing. Help me to, be wise in this situation, whatever the case may be. So even those whispering moments. And then the last one, give God your waning thoughts. What do you do at the end of the day? It's been, Amy and I, we've made it a habit to stop watching the news. I know everybody grew up doing that. I mean, I can remember doing that with my parents. You had to watch the news and you had to see what the weather was going to be. If they just tell you the weather at the start, I could turn it off quickly, but you have to wait till about 15 after they give you that little preview, more is coming, and then they tell you about 15 minutes of bad news about all the things that have happened. This person's killed this person, there's robbery and thievery and everything, and then the weather comes on, then you're expected just to turn it off and go to sleep. Well, what we say is just turn it off ahead of time. Give God your waning thoughts. God, you're in control, you'll take care of it. The weather, everything else, the politics, the problems, the issues of life. So, and then again, maybe crawl into bed and just again look up at the ceiling that you started the day was, God, thank you for preserving me through the day and help me. and review that just to see if He will continue to guide and bless and help you. That's how I think you can have a God-directed heart. I think that's how you can stay a little bit more connected to Jesus. I think that's how He gives us an example of what we should be in our attempts to live for Him. So we'll work on that, and God will bless us, I believe, as we do. Thank you for your good attention this morning. Come back next week. We'll look at another lesson on how Jesus wants to change our lives.